So now that I have my final AO, grime and scratch masks, then I want to just re-export this out just to make sure that all of my UVs are correct. And then I want to go into UE4 and just make sure it's all re-imported nicely. So the next thing to do is to figure out my grime mask and my scratch mask. These will be tiled over my UV2, and then they'll be combined with these masks in order to create masks that will blend through to a metal and a grime material. So what I'm doing at the moment is I'm taking all of my masks and my AO and I'm taking them into one document, and I'm packing these into channels so that red, green, blue and alpha will all hold different masks. And I'm doing this using a Photoshop plugin called QSM. And then I'm also importing these scratch masks. So you can see if you look at the Reaper masks texture that it's super colorful, and that's because it's got alpha masks in all of the red, green and blue channels. So all I want to do now is the red channel on that is the components AO. So I'm replacing the AO on all of the components with that one channel, just to make sure it looks good. And then once I've done this, then I'll go through and I will start to create a new shader that's being used for the bodywork as opposed to the components. So this is the base paint job that's being used on the asset. So I'm going to bring in this Reaper masks, and I'm going to plug in the red channel, which is the ambient occlusion for the bodywork. I'm also going to multiply that with the color, so you can see now it becomes quite intense. And then I want to multiply that again by quite a light color, just to reduce the effect of what the AO is doing. And what I need to do is go to the texture and change the texture type to masks, because at the moment it just wasn't giving me the correct results. Because the texture isn't a normal color image, then I need to make sure it's imported as a masks texture as opposed to just a normal color image, because each channel is doing its own individual job, so it should be treated like they're all individual linear textures. So now what I'm doing is I'm using the AO in order to slightly darken the albedo of this shader. So next thing I want to do is bring in my scratch and my grime masks, and I also want to do a lerp scratch grime node. So lerp scratch grime node will use a combination of my masks to tell the shader where it's allowed to scratch and where it's allowed to add grime, and then it will linearly interpolate between the two, which is why it's called a lerp. So now you can see that I've just created a black texture and I've plugged that into grime, and then I've plugged my grime mask into that. So now I want to multiply that by an actual grime texture, and when I save that, you can see that now the grime texture breaks this up. And I also want to tell it that it's using the second UV set instead of the first. So this means that my grime mask is now blending through an actual mask that will break it up to make it look nice. And now the black can just be tinted to whatever color I want in order to make it look like grime. So this just looks like a build up of grime in those cavities on the actual asset. And then I could do this exact same process again, but I could do that so that I could change the roughness. I could even blend between normal maps or rough or metallic if I wanted to. But for this one, I'm just going to adjust the roughness based on where the grime is. So you can see here that all I'm doing is just making these small changes to the actual roughness. And then a lot of these areas will actually be parameterized so that I can duplicate this shader and do all of the hardware with it as well. So I'm just doing exactly the same thing now, where I'm telling the scratch mask that it needs to look at UV2 instead of UV1. And then I'll combine that with my scratch mask that I baked to say where the scratches are allowed to be. And I'm using a 1- node to invert the result, so that now you can see that I have like scratches coming through. And again, these are just black textures coming through on those edges. And I'm just using this number just to give me a little bit of color here. And eventually what I want to do is to be able to blend between metalness and non-metalness here. So I'll need to have a third scratch grime mask, which would blend between metalness and non-metalness. So the paint job would be non-metalness, and these scratches would be metalness, and that would help to give it that extra level of information. So now all I'm doing is I'm bringing in a metal material and metal albedo, so that on those areas then I can tell it to look at the metal texture that I set up in Dedo. And then on the roughness, then it would look at the roughness from my Dedo metal, and then the same on the metalness. So now that you can see that my scratches are coming through, then I can probably just add a multiply to the color of this. And then it just means I can slightly adjust the color of the actual metal. So I can make it a little bit darker or a little bit lighter, depending on what I want my result to be. So I'm just going to make this very slightly darker than it was. And then what I can do is, once I'm happy, is I can convert all of these elements into parameters so that I can start to change the textures. So now that I'm happy with the results, I can go through and parameterize the areas I want. So maybe I want on the hardware the roughness of the grime to be a little bit different. Maybe I want the color of the grime to be a little bit different. And then I'll probably also want to expose all of the textures so that I can plug the hardware textures into the hardware itself. So you can see now that I've created an instance and I've applied that to the bodywork so that I can easily change the grime and scratch power whenever I want. Because this is much more real-time feedback, so it looks a lot nicer and happens a lot quicker. And then the last thing I have to do is to create one extra instance for my hardware. So I'm just going to convert all of these to textures, or use current textures, and then I'm going to convert these to parameters. And then I'm creating another instance called hardware or dark body, because this is just the dark bodywork instead of the painted bodywork. And I'm just going to swap all of these textures out to be hardware. And then I'm just going to adjust the values that I've parameterized to give it a nice result. So this is my drone finished. So once I've set up these values, then I can just go and take my screenshots and get these on ArtStation. So I hope this has been useful, and I hope this helps you with your next piece. Thank you very much.